Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today we're going to finish close reading Beowulf from lines 2200 or so to the end, to line 3182. And we're going to really kind of notice in this section that this poem's tone really kind of shifts. This is something that I spoke a little bit about at the end of the last video, but I want to touch on it again because these videos are split up into three parts. And whenever I teach Beowulf, I usually split it up into three different parts, just because then you can do about 1,000 lines at a time, and it's very manageable to do in about an hour chunk, or at least more manageable. But this poem is really two parts. It's two halves. The first half is Beowulf in his youth, fighting all of these monsters and doing all this stuff for Hrothgar. And the second half is Beowulf as an old man, as an old king. And the reason why I emphasize this so much is because thematically, it's really important to think about this text as two sides or two halves. A lot of scholars have really focused on this idea of Beowulf, the poem, being kind of a blend of two different things. J.R.R. Tolkien, for instance, very famously, in his famous essay, The Monster and the Critics, which is still a seminal essay, still foundational to understanding Beowulf. It was on my comprehensive reading list for my comprehensive exams. It was written in 1937, so the fact that it still hasn't gone out of style is pretty impressive. But he notes that Beowulf, at the heart of Beowulf, is a meditation on youth and old age, and this kind of meditative back and forth between those two things. Many scholars have taken that up and have thought about Beowulf as, again, this kind of binary between two different sides. The pagan past, the Christian present, the Germanic heroic past, and the Anglo-Saxon present, in which this poem is probably written down. All these different things. And in fact, again, a lot of scholars do point directly to the way Old English poetry works, in that we have two half lines, that you have to have the first half and the second half to make up the full thing. So that this idea is very present throughout this poem. Life and death, monsters and heroes, all that kind of stuff. But just something to keep in mind as we move through this last section, because my students always notice how different the tone feels. It feels much more somber. It feels much more elegiac, and all these different things. So something to keep in mind. And then just one other thing that I wanted to mention before we jump into this section, line 2200, is we kind of skipped over, because I was trying to finish quickly, this very small moment that we get where we learn a little bit about Beowulf's childhood that I just think is quite interesting and worth mentioning. Which is when Beowulf has come back to Geatland. He is talking to Hygelac, right, his lord. He's relayed all these stories, and we get this small section where we get a small bit about how Beowulf bore himself with valor. He never cut down a comrade who was drunk, right? Luckily for Unferth, as we saw in the first part, he never did that. He kept his temper. He did all this cool stuff. But then we get this small moment where it just says, he, Beowulf, had been poorly regarded for a long time, was taken by the Geats for less than he was worth, and their lord, too, had never much esteemed him in the mead hall. They firmly believed that he lacked force, that the prince was a weakling, but presently every affront to his deserving was reversed. So this idea that Beowulf's childhood, when he was a kid, he wasn't a prodigy, right? He wasn't prodigious. He was a layabout. He was a lazy kid. This is just something that is pretty common in a lot of medieval Germanic stories. It's kind of a motif of when the kid is young, the kid is lazy, and but that laziness almost indicates a sense of grandeur that once they grow up and mature, they will become something bigger and better. This is something, for instance, that we see very famously, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, in Grettir Saga, the Old Norse Grettir Saga, with the main character Grettir. When he's a kid, he's way worse than Beowulf. He's not only lazy, he's also just like a terrible person. We'll come back to, there's some interesting connections with Grettir Saga that I'll mention briefly throughout this episode. But I wanted to mention this because, we're dealing with this character who is, heroic in so many different ways. And as we've talked about, he's also kind of problematic in a lot of different ways. But this idea of him being, as a kid, as a youth, very lazy and, not heroic, is something that changes throughout his life. But now, when we're looking at Beowulf, we're dealing with Beowulf in his old age, right? The poem jumps ahead way into the future, and at this moment, we even the opening lines to this section. A lot was to happen in later days. In the fury of battle, Hygelac fell, and the shelter of Heardred's shield proved useless against the fierce aggression of the Shieldthings. So Hygelac is now dead. And we got a reference to this earlier, right? This has been foreshadowed for, almost exactly 2,000 lines, actually. Right after Wealhtheow gives her speech in the first, or I guess in the second part. And she gives Beowulf this necklace. The Brosings necklace that we talked about is also in a lot of the Old Norse traditions. Freya wears that necklace, for instance, in the myths. We're told that Hygelac wears this necklace on his last raid, where he dies, right? And he dies because of this feud that he started with the Frisians. Fate swept him away because of his proud need to provoke a feud. So again, we get this reference to this feud that he's having, and Hygelac is dead. So we're told that Beowulf becomes king. He ruled it well for 50 winters, grew old and wise as a warden of the land, until one day began to dominate the dark, a dragon on the prowl from the steep vaults of a stone-roofed barrow. So again, we talked a little bit last time about this emphasis on ruling for 50 years, for 50 wintra, or hund misera, 100 seasons, which is also 50 years. That Beowulf shares this in common with both Hrothgar and Grendel's mother. And again, we also see, just like Hrothgar, he ruled peacefully for 50 years, and then a monster showed up, right? So Beowulf is so clearly mirroring the kingship of Hrothgar here. He's ruling perfectly well, he's a great king, 50 years, and then a monster shows up, and he has to try to figure out how to deal with it. Also worth keeping in mind, 50 years have passed. This is something a lot of my students don't pick up on right away. How old does that make Beowulf? Right, if Beowulf was killing Grendel when he was, at the youngest, say 18, right, where he's a young hero, he's 18 years old, this would make Beowulf 68 years old, at least. More likely, Beowulf was fighting Grendel when he was probably closer to 30, maybe 35, right? This would make Beowulf 80 or 85 years old. Keep that in mind as we go through this section. Beowulf is an old man, a really old man, right? He's in his 80s. And we get this dragon, right? This dragon comes in. This dragon has this hoard of treasure under a mountain, and someone manages to go in and steal it, and steal something from the dragon. And we find out later, just a couple pages later, that the thing that the thief stole was a cup. And this makes the dragon really angry, right? And the dragon drove into a rage, as the people of the country would soon discover. The dragon goes out and begins laying waste to all of these people. If this sounds familiar, I mentioned Tolkien earlier. If this sounds like Smaug and The Hobbit, well, you'd be right. Tolkien drew on this directly. There are so many just clear parallels. Tolkien was very, very clearly drawing on this entire story. And we'll actually come back to that because the parallels just keep coming. So this guy who steals from the dragon is called a slave. He's probably it's unclear if he's actually a slave or if he's just kind of a low-class person or something like that. But he steals from this dragon. And we actually learn what I think is a very interesting passage, where this treasure came from. Right? This dragon is laying on this massive treasure for 300 years asleep. And we learn where it came from, right? There were many other heirlooms heaped inside the earth house, because long ago, with deliberate care, somebody now forgotten had buried the riches of a highborn race in this ancient cache. Death had come and taken them all in times gone by, and the only one left to tell their tale, the last of their line, could look forward to nothing but the same fate for himself. He foresaw that his joy in the treasure would be brief. So this guy who is the last of his kind, right, the last of his race, we get the word kunis, which just means like people, right? Like the English are called the Anglo-Kun, the people of the Angles. Everyone has died, probably through war, right? We learn a little bit about this, about what drove these people to all die. And this guy is the last of his race. And so he takes all the treasure and he buries it. And he gives this just wonderful speech that, if you're familiar at all with other Old English poetry, you'll recognize very quickly. And we'll look at another poem in just a second. He gives this speech. Now earth, hold what earls once held, and heroes can no more. It was mine from you first by honorable men. My own people have been ruined in war. One by one, they went down to death, looked to their last on sweet life in the hall. I am left with nobody to bear a sword or burnish plated goblets, put a sheen on the cup. The companies have departed. The hard helmets, hasped with gold, will be stripped of its hoops, and the helmet shiner, who should polish the metal of the war mask, sleeps, etc. Right? Everyone, all my friends are dead, and all of their armor, their cool armor and weapons, they're all going to rot. This is something that is known as the ubi sunt motif, which is a Latin phrase which literally just means where are ... where are something. And it's basically just an elegiac form that Old English poets use quite a bit. We see this, for instance, and I'm just using this translation because it's the only collection of like almost every Anglo-Saxon poem with facing page translation. But we see this in The Wanderer, which is a very famous Old English poem, which is very, very good. Kind of one of the most famous. If you read any Old English poetry, you probably read this one. And this is all about this guy who is this exile, right? He walks the wadan reiklastas. Right? He walks the path of exiles. This is something, again, we talked a little bit about exiles last time. And this guy's an exile, right? He goes alone. He oft him anhaga, often he alone. We saw that word with Grendel, right? Grendel was called, I think, an anhan sheapa, right? A one-stepper, a one-goer. Or no, an ahan genga, a one-goer. Apologies, forgot the exact word. But this guy's all alone. He gives this great long speech about how everyone he knows is dead. Like all of his kith and kin died, right? There was this big battle and everyone died. And he goes on and he has these very famous lines that I just want to look at very, very quickly, and we'll come back to Beowulf. He has this ubi sunt moment where he asks, right? He kind of yells to the heavens, "Huercam merg, huercam mago, huercam mathugifa, huercam simbla gestu, huer sin non celedremas." Where is the horse gone? The young bucks, the kind king. Where is the banquet assembly gone? The merrymaking. This is a pretty weird translation, to be honest. But where is the horse? Where is the rider? Again, if you're familiar with the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, this is the exact same speech that King Theoden gives at one of the funerals, I think in the Two Towers. It could be Return of the King, where he is wondering where all of these things went, right? I'm pretty sure he actually even says, "Where is the horse? Where is the rider?" Right? Tolkien's directly quoting this poem. But the reason I bring this up is because, well, one, this represents a pretty significant tone shift from the first part, where we're really already thinking about death and the fleeting nature of life, right? Everything is going to die. This seems to be something that the poet is struggling with throughout this poem, and we'll come back to this at the very end of the poem. But the poet is very concerned. The poet, remember, is a Christian. Certainly a Christian, right? This poem might have been pagan at some point. This version that we have is 100% written by someone who is Christian, or at least edited by someone who is Christian, right? I'm trying to temper my words here because this is a very fierce debate in the scholarship. The poet is Christian, and he's writing about all of these characters who are pagan. And, well, what happens to pagans? Do they get eternal life like Christians? No, they don't. Only Christians get eternal life. So it's very sad. And our poet seems to be kind of concerned and, I mean, just kind of sad about all of this. We'll come back to this at the end. This random guy, again, this guy who we don't know his name, gives this great long speech. I just love that it's just somebody now forgotten. Right? We don't even know his name. We're not even given a name. We're not even made up a name. It's very, 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 very poetic in a way. This unnamed man asking where everyone went when, his name has also left us. But very cool. The dragon goes and kills a bunch of people, right? He becomes the scourge of the people. And he starts killing all of these people so may a man not marked by fate easily escape exile and woe by the grace of God. That's right, the dragon's attacking, and of course, like always happens in war, the first to suffer were the people on the land, but before long it was their treasure giver who would come to grief. So the people are obviously bearing the brunt of this, right? The dragon is destroying their farms and all this stuff. I kind of like this. I kind of like how there is like this almost like class consciousness happening here. Not really, I'm obviously using that word anachronistically, or that phrase anachronistically. But there seems to be a little bit of like class consciousness going on. He, starts killing everyone, and Beowulf finds out, right? Then Beowulf was given bad news, a hard truth. His own home, the best of buildings, had been burnt to a cinder, the throne room of the Geats. Again, this is mirroring perfectly what happens with Grendel and Hrothgar, right? Grendel destroys Hrothgar's Celeste, his hall. And of course, this hall, just like Heorot, is Bolda Celeste, the best of buildings. And Beowulf gets really sad about this, obviously. And he's trying to figure out what to do with this. He's trying to figure out how to deal with this dragon, right? Dragons are probably difficult to deal with. Yet the Prince of the Rings was too proud to line up with a large army against the Sky Plague. He had scant regard for the dragon as a threat, no dread at all of its courage or strength, for he had kept going, often in the past, through perils and ordeals of every sort. After he had purged Hrothgar's hall, triumphed in Heorot, and beaten Grendel, he outgrappled the monster and his evil kin. Right? Beowulf's pride sustains him. I think that's actually a pretty good just note by Seamus Heaney. Right? And of course we get over Hogode Tha. Right? Beowulf is prideful, and he is obviously concerned about this dragon, but he's not worried about being able to defeat it. And so Beowulf has this idea that, I can go kill the dragon, and he has it, but then immediately we're shifted, right? Beowulf's talking about, or he's thinking about, we're told by the narrator, he's thinking about these past heroic feats that he had, but then immediately we're shifted back to Hygelac's death, which is quite interesting narratologically, right? One of the cruelest hand-to-hand encounters that happened when Hygelac, king of the Geats, was killed in Friesland, right? In Frisia. The people's friend and lord, Hrethel's son, slaked a sword blade's thirst for blood, right? That's such a good image, right? Slaked a sword blade's thirst for blood. Hygelac was, his thirst was quenched by sword blades, Pretty brutal. But Beowulf, right? We learned last time Beowulf's a great swimmer. We learned in the first episode and the second episode Beowulf's a great swimmer. Beowulf survives this battle by running and jumping into the water and swimming away, right? And he carries 30 battle dresses, right? 30 bits of chainmail. And he swims all the way home, right? Across the wide sea, desolate and alone. This is one kind of insane, right? Again, there is this feat of swimming, right? This is, and you can look, I mean, if you know a map where Frisia, modern day Frisia is, and modern day, southern Sweden, this is a swim of a couple hundred miles. So Beowulf is swimming across, kind of the North Sea with all of this armor and stuff like that. But again, we see this idea of the lone survivor. Beowulf is the only one who survives. Very similar to, this guy that we just saw, who buried all of this treasure. Right, this guy we just saw speak, he was the last survivor of this big battle. Now Beowulf is the last survivor of this battle. And he goes all the way home, right? He goes to Hygelac, who is Hygelac's queen. And Hygelac essentially asks Beowulf to help, in any way possible. So Beowulf becomes a sort of counselor to Hygelac's children, who are very young, right? Heodred is very young at this time. So Beowulf is kind of a counselor. And then we're told about this other feud that is happening with kings in Sweden. I'm not going to get super into the details here because it's very confusing, and I'd have to kind of draw like a family tree and all that stuff. It's very, very interesting and it's very essential to the plot. But I think what we can kind of summarize here is that there is this other feud happening with the Scilfings between kind of Hygelac's tribe that Beowulf is now kind of counseling, and these Swedes. And Heodred, right, Hygelac's son, gets killed. And the Swedish king, Onela, kind of just after he kills Heodred, right, because they had this feud, and we've talked a little bit about feuds. Once Onela kills Heodred, he goes back home, right? He successfully completed the blood feud. Again, there's a lot of details that we're kind of skipping here. But we get this line that is super, super important. Onela goes back to the land of Sweden, leaving Beowulf to ascend the throne, right? To ascend Hygelac's throne, right? Because Hygelac's kid was just killed. To sit in majesty and rule over the Geats. That was god kuning. We've seen this line, this sentence, right, twice before. Once in line 11, right, with Skilshaving. That was god kuning. And then we see it here. The problem with this line is it's actually unclear who that that was. What's the antecedent to this pronoun? Is it Beowulf or is it Onela, the king of the Swedes? It's actually difficult, and scholars are pretty split on this. There really isn't a consensus. A lot of people think that it refers to Onela, and others think it refers to Beowulf. And it's quite important because in this whole section, we're really thinking about Beowulf's kingship. And is Beowulf actually a good king? And we'll come back to this question again at the end. It's unclear if the narrator is saying that Beowulf is a good king or not. Right? Just like we saw with Hrothgar, where it said, Ak, that was god kuning, but that was a good king. It was again a bit unclear if the narrator was saying that Hrothgar was a good king or not. So, this feud keeps going. Beowulf goes and settles the feud, right? The feud was settled on a comfortless campaign when he killed Onela, right? Beowulf goes basically on a killing rampage, and he settles the feud. He goes and kills Onela. And then we're brought back into the present. But keep this in mind. Keep the fact that Beowulf just went and killed, essentially, the Swedish king. in mind. We come back to the problem at hand, which is this dragon who's killing a bunch of people. And Beowulf decides, okay, let's go kill him. And it says, the Lord of the Geats took 11 comrades and went in a rage to reconnoitre. By then he had discovered the cause of the affliction by being visited on the people. The precious cup had come to him from the hand of the finder, the one who had started all this strife, and was now added as a 13th to their number. So Beowulf gathers his 11 best men and brings the thief along. Again, if you're familiar with The Hobbit, this is the 12 hobbits, or the 12 hobbits, and they have to bring along a thief. They have to bring along Bilbo. So we see this here, right? This is, Tolkien is very clearly alluding to this. But so they make the thief bring them to the mountain where the dragon is laying. And he does. And they go. And Beowulf has this eerie foreboding. You know, the veteran king sat down when he got there. Again, remember Beowulf's age. He is an old man. They just hiked all the way to where this dragon lays. The veteran king sat down on a cliff top. I think it's a reference to, Beowulf's, he's old, right? He was sad at heart, unsettled yet ready, sensing his death. His fate hovered near, unknowable, but certain. It would soon claim his coffered soul, part life from limb. Before long, the prince's spirit would spin free from his body. I mean, this isn't even foreshadowing at this point. This is just telling us what's going to happen. Again, we get this idea of fate basically being unstoppable. And fate, of course, in Old English is weird. Right, we saw this in The Wanderer. Go read The Wanderer if you want to read more. I mentioned it a little bit in the first episode, I believe, where The Wanderer has a great line, "Where bithful arad." Fate is inexorable or unescapable or something like that. So, Beowulf is very somber. But he gives this great speech, right, where he addresses his companions, his men. And this section, by the way, is also just filled with way more speeches than the first section. It's just kind of again, another tonal shift. But here we get this more history about how Beowulf came to be in the service of Hygelac. And again, this is a little bit confusing because we have a bunch of people named Heribald, Heithcún, Hygelac, all these people, Hrethel, all these people who are named very similar names. So we'll kind of go through this quickly. But basically what happens is these two brothers, Heribald and Heithcún, one of them kills the other, right? I think Heithcún bent his horn-tipped bow and loosed the arrow that destroyed his life. He shot wide and buried a shaft in the flesh and blood of his own brother. So he accidentally kills his brother. And we get, again, from Beowulf, which is quite interesting, this image of Hrethel, the king, right, who one of his sons just killed the other one, who doesn't know what to do, right? Because what you would normally do, if someone killed one of your sons, you would then go kill that person, or you'd kill one of their sons, or something like that. The problem is that these are all kinsmen, right? They're brothers who killed each other. You're not going to go and kill one of your sons because he killed one of your other sons. It's very difficult to do, right? We get, the offense was beyond redress, a wrong footing of the heart's affections. For who could avenge the prince's life or pay his death price? Right? We talked about weregeld. How do you pay for the killing of your brother? Who do you pay? But so once again, we get all of this imagery of feuds and how feuds are, well, a really bad idea. Because how does a feud end? There's no way for a feud to end. The only way for a feud to end is for everyone to die, right? We saw this way back earlier. We won't go back through this entirely, but we saw this earlier with the Finnisburg episode back in part 1, right, where we get this whole story about these two tribes that kind of entered a feud, and then the only way it was ended was basically all the leaders were killed. Once again, we see this, and we get this old man lamenting, being elegiac, being sorrowful. The old man begins to keen and weep for his boy, watching the raven gloat where he hangs. He can be of no help. The wisdom of age is worthless to him. Old people, right? This is very like almost like Cormac McCarthy-esque, right? This is no country for old men. The wisdom of age is worthless to him. What do you do in this situation? And Beowulf is telling this whole story, right? He keeps going on. We get this other image of the horsemen are sleeping, the warriors underground. What was is no more. Again, this ubi sunt motif. Once again, we get a reference that you can't end this blood feud at all. And so Hrethel, heartsore, wearied, turned away from life's joy, chose God's light, and departed, leaving buildings and lands to his sons, a man of substance will. So Hrethel decides to just basically leave, right? He leaves all of this, right? What else do you do? Importantly, though, once the king leaves, all these wars break out again between the Swedes and the Geats. Keep this in mind, right? We just kind of mentioned this feud between the Swedes and the Geats, right? We get all this stuff with Ongenthau and all of these people. We're gonna kind of just skip over this because it's just a bit much. But there is this giant feud going on, and we get reference to the fact that Beowulf was one of the ones who helped end this feud. Right. Hygelac lavished on me what I paid for when I fought, as fortune allowed me with my glittering sword. He gave me no land, and security land brings. So he had no call to go look for some lesser champion, some mercenaries, right? So because Beowulf is so powerful, Hygelac doesn't have to go form these other alliances, right? He doesn't have to get other mercenaries or other groups. He just relies just on Beowulf. This idea of just relying only on Beowulf is very important for the last part of this poem, because what happens when Beowulf is no more? Well, we'll find out. Beowulf talks about how he went to Sweden. He marched there. He attacks this guy named Dayraven in front of two armies. And listen to how he kills him. He brought back no looted breastplate to the Frisian king, but fell in battle, their standard bearer, highborn and brave. No sword blade sent him to his death. My bare hands stilled his heartbeats and wrecked the bone house. Now blade and hand, sword and sword stroke will essay the horde. So Beowulf goes and he kills this Dayraven who is in Frisian to kind of end that feud. But we're told that Beowulf doesn't use a sword to kill him. And this is something that we've noticed throughout this poem, that Beowulf's swords all kind of suck. He is never able to use a sword. He's a better fighter with his bare hands. Who fights with their bare hands? Grendel fought with his bare hands. Grendel's mother fought with her bare hands. Animals fight with their bare hands, right? Warriors fight with swords and shields. Why does Beowulf always fight with his bare hands, right? When we saw with Grendel, he grappled him. When we saw with Grendel's mother, he eventually ended up using a sword. But for most of that fight, he was grappling. Well, this brings up something that I like bringing up, but I don't want it to fully affect all of your readings because it is very controversial among scholars. But so I don't like bringing up at the beginning of the poem, but I like bringing up now, which is Beowulf's name. Is a weird name. We have, I think, and I'm pretty sure this is true, in the entire Old English like linguistic corpus, I think we get this name only one other time outside this poem. I think there's like one guy in Northumbria in like the 10th century whose name is Beowulf, or something like Beowulf. I think it's actually Beowulf, like B-I, wolf. So it's actually a little bit different. But Beowulf, and I think you can probably see, like, based on people's names, that their names are kind of what tell you what clan they're a part of, right? If we go back to King Hrethel, his sons are named Heribald and Haethcune not Hygelac. I think Hygelac's like a cousin. But these characters, right? They all begin with like the Hera, which just means like battle. We saw this much earlier with Hrothgar, right? Who all his kids' names both begin with that HR sound. Beowulf's name is very different. And one scholarly idea about Beowulf's name, why he's named Beowulf, is that Beowulf's name isn't necessarily a proper name, but it's a kenning, right? It's one of those metaphors. It's one of those images that we saw right in the opening lines when they traveled over the Hraunhrada, the whale road. And if you split up this name into two parts, Beo means bee, right? Like the insect, a bee. And wolf, well, means wolf. That's pretty obvious. Who is the wolf of the bees? The bear. Some scholars have made the argument that Beowulf's name is a kenning for bear, and that Beowulf himself is very bear-like. And I think this holds some weight, considering how often we're told about Beowulf's hand grip, right? He has a strength of 30 men in his hands, right? We talked about when he was fighting Grendel, there was all this hand imagery. Beowulf hugs this guy to death, right? He doesn't like choke him out or something like that. He stilled his heartbeats and wrecked the bone house, right? The bone house. Those are your ribs. He bear hugged this man to death. And this is something that is, well, I think very, very interesting. And there's a great essay by Christopher Abram that will be in the description below if you're interested in checking this out. Because I personally think this is actually a pretty compelling argument, though a lot of scholars don't like it. And there's actually some really interesting connections, if you're interested in this, with the Old Norse Saga, where there's a character in here who's very Beowulfian, and is actually much more Beowulfian, or much more bear-like in his Beowulfianness, right? His name is Borvar Bjarki. There's also, in Grettir Saga, Grettir does very similar things to Beowulf, and there's connections to Grettir Saga in the Old Norse again, which are all quite interesting. And I should note, if you are interested in either of those texts, these are the translations that I'd recommend. The Jesse Byock in the Oxford World's Classics, and Saga of King Hrolf in Penguin, which I think is also Jesse Byock. That could be wrong. Yeah, it is Jesse Byock. Anyways, so Beowulf's name is, I think, quite interesting. If we think of him as almost out of a fairy tale, right? Almost out of a myth. He then kind of transcends the human. He's more animal than human. That might explain some of his choices, right? That might explain some of his monstrosity. But who knows? Beowulf now, after retelling this whole thing about how he squeezed this man to death, speaks a boast. And I find this speech to be absolutely fascinating, like I do almost every speech in this poem, which I didn't know you're probably getting sick of hearing me say that. Beowulf spoke, made a formal boast for the last time. I risked my life often when I was young. Now I am old, but as a king of the people, I shall pursue this fight for the glory of winning, if the evil one will only abandon his earth fort, face me in the open. Again, recollecting how when he was young, he was this big hero. This is also, by the way, almost exactly what Hrothgar says. Hrothgar doesn't go on and say, okay, I'll go fight Grendel now, but he does talk about how when he was a young man, he did all these awesome things. But listen to this speech. Beowulf addresses each dear companion, right? His 11 hand-picked men. And again, when we're thinking about this, Beowulf is the king now. He is the lord. His men are, should be, very loyal to him. Think of how loyal, once Beowulf entered Hrothgar's court, how loyal Beowulf was to Hrothgar. Beowulf turns to these men, who are resolute and highborn, and says, I would rather not use a weapon if I knew another way to grapple with the dragon and make good my boast, as I did against Grendel in days gone by. But I shall be meeting molten venom in the fire he breathes. So I go forth in mail shirt and shield. Right? Again, I wish I could grapple him to death, but I'll have to use a shield because, well, the dragon has fire. It's not really a fair fight. And he goes on. Then he says this, again, speaking to his men. Men at arms, remain here on the barrow, safe in your armor, to see which one of us is better in the end at bearing wounds in a deadly fray. This fight is not yours, nor is it up to any man except me to measure his strength against the monster or to prove his worth. I shall win the gold by my courage, or else mortal combat, doom of battle, will bear your lord away. What's Beowulf saying here? Is this a heroic boast in which Beowulf is saying, you guys don't have to worry about this. I will take care of it. Or is there something else in here? Men at arms, remain here on the barrow, safe in your armor. This fight is not yours. Is it not their fight? Remember when Hrothgar had this big problem and Hrothgar was an old king? Who stepped up? Beowulf. Who does Beowulf need right now? Well, he needs a Beowulf. He needs someone to step up for him. I think he's critiquing his men here because none of his men have stepped up and said, I'll fight the dragon. I think this is a scathing critique of his men. And we even see, right, the next sentence right after he gives a speech. Aras tha bithronda, rof oreta. Then he drew himself up beside his shield. Beowulf is sitting down, right, we saw earlier. He's sitting down on the side of the cliff this entire time giving this speech. And then he needs the help of his shield to even stand up. Again, Beowulf is like 80 years old here. He's an old man. I find this whole speech to be a critique of his own men, right? That none of his men have stepped up and want to fight this dragon. You could read this, I think, as a heroic boast, right? That I'll be the hero here. I'll be the one who goes and kills the dragon. But again, if we remember that he's 80 years old, he can barely stand up by himself. I think this is critiquing all of these men that are these are Beowulf's best men. And this should make us start questioning Beowulf's kingship, right? A good king needs to do two things, right? Protect his people. And by doing that, right, you have to surround yourself with good people to help you protect your people. And have a kid, right? Have a male heir to inherit the throne. Well, we'll find out about that second part in just a bit. But Beowulf clearly doesn't have that good of men around him. Beowulf goes in to battle, right? I'm assuming like with a cane and everything, right? No coward path. He goes in. Hard by the rock face, that hale veteran, a good man who had gone repeatedly into combat and danger and come through, saw a stone arch and a gushing stream that burst from the barrow, blazing and wafting a deadly heat. Something really small that I think is interesting. The fact that there's a stone arch here. Stanbogan. The early Germanic people, at this time in like the 6th century, the 7th century, they didn't build in stone. The people who built in stone were the Romans, right? The Romans were the ones who built big stone arches. It wasn't until, the 11th century, maybe a little bit in the 10th, that Anglo-Saxons and people like that started building in stone again. It's actually kind of similar. It reminds me of, and I'm not going to look at it because I don't feel like bringing it up right now, but it reminds me a little bit of the poem The Ruin which is a really famous poem, which talks about the entaille work, the work of giants, which are these big Roman buildings that litter, that are all over Britain, essentially. And these people don't know how they were built, and so they kind of assume that they must have been built by giants, right? Because the amount of architectural intelligence to build big stone arches is a bit beyond these early Germanic people. But anyways, small thing. But I think we kind of see like the almost kind of like a haunting of history that they're fighting in this old ruin. Anyways, they begin fighting. Right, Beowulf gave a shout. The Lord of the Geats unburdened his breast and broke out in a storm of anger. Under grey stone, his voice challenged and resounded clearly. Hate was ignited. The Horde Guard recognized a human voice. The time was over for peace and parleying. Beowulf gives a big shout, right? And he charges him. The Horde Guard, right, pouring forth in a hot battle fume, the breath of the monster burst from the rock. There was a rumble underground. Down there in the barrow, Beowulf the warrior lifted his shield. One thing that's really interesting here, and this will look a little bit at the Old English. Well, there's two things that I think are interesting. One, when Beowulf is named here, and I've checked the manuscript, it's in the manuscript as well, he isn't called Beowulf, he's called Bjorn. Biorn, which, if you know any Scandinavian languages, Bjorn just means bear, right? So, like, occasionally in this poem, in the manuscript, Beowulf's name is shortened to just Beo, like Beow. But here, it's spelled Bjorn, which I'm pretty sure is the only example of it in the manuscript. I could be wrong on that, though. But I did check, and I find that to just be fascinating. He's literally called Bear here. But one thing that is very interesting, based on what we talked about in the first episode and the second episode with that word aglaca. From eras quom oruth aglaken, ut of stain, hat hilda swat. The dragon here is named Aglacan, right? We talked about that word. It kind of means like terrible thing or awesome one or something like that. Or, as Seamus Heaney translates it, monster. But again, we saw how this word is kind of problematic because Siemund was called Aglaca, and Beowulf may have been referred to as Aglaca when he was fighting the sea beasts in Grendel's mother's lair. But just one second. They keep fighting, right? Beowulf is getting swaddled in flames. Such a cool image. But he's using a shield this time, which is great because he needs it because there's fire coming at him. We get this big, epic, long battle, right? There's all these flames that's happening. This is Beowulf's most difficult fight, of course. Before long, the fierce contenders clashed again. Nes tha long to thon, that tha aglaken, hut ef yemeton. Before long, the fierce contenders clashed again. The interesting thing, this aglaken is plural. We know this because of the demonstrative pronoun, tha, right in front of it, is plural. And it's the plural demonstrative pronoun for either the nominative or the accusative case. Well, nouns in Old English, just like in German, have to agree in both case and gender to the pronoun, right? The demonstrative pronoun has to agree in case and number and gender to the noun. Beowulf and the dragon right here are being both referred to as Aglaken. It's 100% clear. The fierce contenders, the two monsters, are Beowulf and the dragon. I think that's just absolutely fascinating. Because again, we saw Grendel be referred to as Aglaca. We saw Grendel's mother be referred to as Aglaca. We saw either Beowulf or the sea beasts in Grendel's mother's mirror be referred to as Aglaca. We saw Siemund be referred to as Aglaca. The dragon as Aglaca. Now it's Beowulf and the dragon are both Aglaca. Very, very cool. and also just like thinking about them being referred to as the same, right? I think we talked about this a little bit in the fight with Grendel and with Grendel's mother, that when they start fighting, they kind of become one. They merge together into like this one new monster, right? Kind of like I don't know, like a transformer or something. But we saw this with Grendel when they were fighting in Heorot, that they both started destroying the hall as they rolled around together. Pretty interesting stuff. Beowulf is kind of getting destroyed here, right? His glittering sword, infallible before that day, failed when he unsheathed it, as it should never have. Beowulf's sword fails him again. He cannot use weapons, right? We've never seen him fully use a sword, right? Again, he used it with the sea beasts in Grendel's mother's mere. But even the sword he used to kill Grendel's mother wasn't a normal sword. Remember, it was a sword Entish, an Entish sword, a giantish sword. Beowulf's sword fails again. Kind of going back again, I think, to his monstrosity. But within one heart within one heart sorrow welled up. In a man of worth, the claims of kinship cannot be denied. One man finally decides to fight, right? Because, well, I guess I should have started with this. All Beowulf's men are watching this, right? And it says that no help or backing was to be had then from his highborn comrades. That hand-picked troop broke ranks and ran for their lives to the safety of the wood. All of his men run. They all flee when they see Beowulf getting overtaken. But one man, it seems like he does run at first, but then he stops and decides to turn back. And his name is Wiglaf, or Wiglaf. I'll probably pronounce him Wiglaf, because that G should kind of be like a soft G. Who is the son of Weohstan, who is a Scylfing warrior, which has this whole interesting bit, because we saw the Scylfings later in Sweden. They were a part of the tribe that Beowulf's Geats were feuding with. But Wiglaf sees his lord tormented by the heat of his scalding helmet, and he remembers, Wiglaf remembers, the bountiful gifts bestowed on him, how well he lived among the Waemundings, the freehold he inherited from his father before him. He could not hold back. Right? He remembers that Beowulf gave him all of these gifts, that Beowulf was a good king to him. And this is the first reference to the Waemundings, which is kind of bizarre. It's kind of like an ethnic group within the Geats. Both him and Beowulf are Waemundans, which may indicate, and again, scholars argue about this all the time, it may indicate that Wiglaf is Beowulf's like nephew or something, but it's very unclear in this poem. A lot of scholars have spilt a lot of ink talking about that, and I'm not exactly sure what to think. We get this backstory of Weohstan's father, who had this feud, and basically Beowulf helped out with this feud. So Wiglaf is now sort of one of Beowulf's men. Right, I'm kind of skimming over it just for simplicity's sake. Wiglaf now turns to all of these men who just fled, and he has another one of these just great speeches. I remember that time when mead was flowing, how we pledged loyalty to our lord in the hall, promised our ring giver we would be worth our price. Make good the gift of the war gear, those swords and helmets, as and when his need required it. He picked us out from the army deliberately, honored us and judged us fit for action, made these lavish gifts, and all because he considered us the best of his arm-bearing thanes. And now, although he wanted this challenge to be one he'd faced by himself alone, the shepherd of our lord, a man unequaled in the quest for glory and a name for daring, now the day has come when this lord we serve needs sound men to give him their support. Wiglaf is reminding all of them, remember how good of a king Beowulf was to us? How he gave us all these gifts? And he handpicked us. We are his best men. And he needs our help now. We should go help him, right? Let us go to him, help our leader through the hot flame and the dread of the fire. As God is my witness, I would rather my body were robbed in the same burning blaze as my gold giver's body than go back home bearing arms. Right? Again, we see this imagery of the lone survivor. Wiglaf does not want to be that lone survivor. That is, well, one, it's insanely shameful to be the lone survivor, but it's also, well, if you read The Wanderer, right, it's one of the saddest things you can be as a warrior man, right, to be without a lord. There also seems to be, so, I mean, obviously Wiglaf is critiquing all these men, right? He's yelling at them and saying, you were good vassals or good thanes back in the hall when Beowulf was giving you drinks and mead and weapons. But now, well, what are you now? Now you're cowards. There does seem to be a little critique here, I think. When Wiglaf says, and now, although he wanted this challenge to be one he'd face by himself alone, he seems to kind of be critiquing Beowulf a little bit, right? He's like, I know Beowulf wanted to do all this by himself, but everyone knew that he couldn't do it. He's an 85-year-old man. It's kind of interesting. But so Wiglaf goes and runs to Beowulf and gives Beowulf basically a pep talk, right? Go on, dear Beowulf. Do everything you said you would when you were still young and vowed you would never let your name and fame be dimmed while you live. Right? Again, Beowulf, remember your boast. You're great. You're Beowulf. It's kind of a funny little pep talk. But he tells Beowulf that I will stand with you. Right? Each they föllestu. I will fully, last by you. Right? I will fully be next to you. And the dragon attacks again. And this time, Wiglaf uses his shield to shield Beowulf, right? And kind of this great image of Wiglaf throwing his shield over Beowulf, and they're both hiding behind it. Beowulf attacks, and Beowulf snaps his sword, right? This famous sword that he has breaks. Again, Beowulf swords aren't effective ever. And the dragon attacks again. And I'm kind of skipping over. I mean, this battle is just one of the better written, one of the better written battles. I think, like in literature, it's very, very good. It's very dramatic. Obviously, I just don't want to read the whole thing out to you. But the dragon comes again, and he bites on Beowulf's neck, which always kind of strikes me as odd that he caught the hero in a rush of flames, clamped sharp fangs into his neck. Beowulf's body ran wet with his lifeblood. It came welling out. It always kind of weirds me out because this dragon is massive, right? We're told this dragon is like 50 feet long, and the dragon is very serpent-like, of course. We have very different kinds of ideas of dragons. And in this poem, he's called a feuds, right? A fire dragon, and the draca just comes from Latin, right? Draco. But he's also called a worm, which is where we get the word worm. And dragons in both Old English and Old Norse are very worm-like. They slither around. They don't have legs. They have wings and they can fly, but they're very worm-like, very snake-like. Which should bring up images, of the Garden of Eden and stuff like that. But we don't need to get into all that. But the fact that the dragon can bite Beowulf's neck seems to me to indicate that the dragon has a very small head, or at least a small maw, I guess. Or Beowulf has a massive neck, who knows. Wiglaf uses this opportunity to go and distract the dragon, right? He attacks the dragon's belly, and it says the flames grew weaker. Seems like by stabbing the dragon in the belly, that the dragon's like fire. He's not able to spit out fire that much. And Beowulf, the king, grabs a new weapon, a new sword, a whale sax, a sax. That's where the word Saxon comes from, because the Saxons were people who fought with saxes. It's basically like a big Bowie knife, essentially. It's like a small sword, like a short sword. And he deals the dragon the death blow. Right? Beowulf dealt it a deadly wound. They had killed the enemy. Courage quelled his life. But, of course, Beowulf is mortally wounded. The wound dealt by the ground burner earlier began to scald and swell. Beowulf discovered deadly poison suppurating inside him, surges of nausea, And so, in his wisdom, the prince realized his state and struggled towards a seat on the rampart. So Beowulf is mortally wounded. And this is actually, quite interestingly, this is exactly how Thor dies in Ragnarok. If you're familiar with Old Norse, in the story of Ragnarok, Thor fights the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, at the last battle. And he kills him, but right before Jormungandr dies, he spits out poison and it hits Thor, and Thor takes 7 steps before falling dead. There's a lot of parallels between Beowulf and Thor that are, I think, quite interesting. They're very, very similar characters in a lot of ways, and very different in a lot of ways as well, which is something I thought I'd point out. Once again, Beowulf, we get this reference to, well, Sheeny translates it as gigantic stones, but the word is on enta ye work, right? Seya enta ye work. Beowulf looks upon this work of giants, right? Again, they're in a stone building or outside of like the kind of a stone ruin, which is the exact phrase used in the poem, The Ruin. Which, let me just bring it up really quick. In The Ruin, right, from the very opening lines, we get Reislik is West Walestan, Werde je Brekon, Bergster Burstan, Brothnas enta je work. And this is, I mean, honestly, a pretty weird translation. I know I complain about translations a lot, but this one's pretty bizarre because they translate Brothnath enta je work, which means like the work of giants were breaking, were crumbling, falling apart as the hue and cry of giants rotted away. It's kind of weird. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is, again, this word enta, which means giant, right? Means ent. This is something that we've seen multiple times throughout this poem, that when we first introduced to Grendel, we're told that he's a descendant of Cain, and from Cain came all of these monsters, including Eontas and Ylva, and Orknea, Swilcha Gigantes, all these giants. So again, we get this like references to all these things that are really old and kind of monstrous. Anyways, I thought that's a pretty interesting little moment. And Beowulf knows that he's dying, right? He begins to, he tells Wiglaf to come here, and he gives this speech. Now is the time when I would have wanted to bestow this armor on my own son, had it been my fortune to have fathered an heir. So, Beowulf, whoops, sorry about the focus. Beowulf is dying right here, and we finally learn that Beowulf does not have a son. Not a very good time for us to learn that, because Beowulf is about to die, and who is going to inherit his kingdom? Well, certainly not his son, because he doesn't have one. This is a really, really, really big problem. And I think it comments a little bit on Beowulf's kingship. Again, a king is supposed to, 1, protect his people, and 2, sort out who's going to inherit the throne when he dies. And a son is the best way to do that. He doesn't have a kid. He goes and explains, kind of lives back on his life. He's talking about 50 years he ruled this kingdom. No king of any neighboring clan would dare face me with troops. None had the power to intimidate me. I took what came, cared for, and stood by things in my keeping. Never fomented quarrels. Never swore a lie. So he keeps talking about how, he ruled in peace for 50 years, which might explain why his warriors all suck at being warriors, because they never had to fight anyone, right? If there was peace for 50 years, well, who are these warriors kind of cutting their teeth with? I'm all for peace, I think it's a good thing that Beowulf ruled in peace, but it does pose a problem for, well, when peace no longer exists. And Beowulf commands Wiglaf, or asks Wiglaf, to go and get the treasure, because Beowulf wants to examine that ancient gold, gaze my fill on those garnered jewels. Right? He, as he's dying, says, go show me what I won. Show me the money, right? Show me the treasure. And Wiglaf goes and does that. He runs into the barrow and pulls out all the treasure and starts bringing it all back out. And we get this all the description of all this stuff in here, and we could probably close read a lot of this stuff. The specific weapons and rusty helmets, armbands everywhere, artfully wrought, all this really cool stuff. If you're interested in what any of this stuff looks like, go look up like the dragon-horde or any of these other great finds that archaeologists, apologies, have found. We know what a lot of this stuff kind of looks like. Wiglaf returns back with all the treasure, or a lot of the treasure, to show Beowulf. And Beowulf commands one last thing. He says, now that I have bartered my last breath to own this fortune, it is up to you to look after their needs. I can hold out no longer. Order my troops to construct a barrow on a headland on the coast after my pyre has cooled. It will loom on the horizon at Hronesness and be a reminder among my people, so that in coming times, crews under sail will call it Beowulf's Barrow as they steer ships across the wide and shrouded waters. Then the king, in his great-heartedness, unclasped the collar of gold from his neck and gave it to the young thane, telling him to use it, and the war shirt, and the gilded helmet well. And then he dies. So what's Beowulf saying here? What's he doing here? Well, he's telling Wiglaf to take all the treasure and build a giant barrow, name it Beowulf's Barrow, and put all the treasure into that barrow. Right? He's not saying give the treasure out to all my men, because his men kind of suck, right? They didn't really do their job. He's saying put it all into this barrow, which should remind us a little bit of that guy we saw earlier who buried all this treasure in the first place, right? That he also buried it all. He didn't give it out. But we also see, this is something, again, a lot of scholars talk a lot about, that when Beowulf unclasps this collar of gold from his neck and gives it to Wiglaf, some scholars have read this as Beowulf basically giving his crown, right? So he didn't really wear, in this instance, he didn't really wear a crown. He wore basically a torque, which is like a thick necklace. Some scholars have read this as Beowulf giving the kingship over to Wiglaf and telling Wiglaf, you're now king. And I think that's pretty fair. A pretty fair reading, though we'll see how that turns out in just a second. And Beowulf, fate swept us away, sent my whole brave highborn clan to their final doom. Now I must follow them. Right? Beowulf's whole clan is dead. Each him after shall. Now I must follow them. That was the warrior's last word. His soul fled from his breast to the destined place among the steadfast ones, which is a pretty interesting, small little reference to Beowulf's soul, which again is a Christian idea, not a pagan idea, and that it goes to his destined place. And this is something that is difficult for this author. What happens to Beowulf? I think we see throughout this poem that the poet admires Beowulf in a lot of ways. But as I've suggested throughout this series, he also doesn't really know what to do with Beowulf. Right? If you've read the Divine Comedy by Dante, you'll note that in the first layer of hell, in the Inferno, the first layer contains the noble pagans, right? The people who, can't go to heaven because, well, they weren't Christian, they weren't baptized, they didn't take the Eucharist, they didn't absolve themselves of sin and all this other stuff. So they're in hell. What happens to Beowulf when he dies? He was a pagan. He was noble in a lot of ways, but he was a pagan. What happens to his soul? Well, it goes to his destined place among the steadfast ones. I think you can read that in a couple different ways. We get this elegy for the dragon which is quite interesting, that there is like this respect for the dragon. And both had reached the end of the road through the life that they had been lent, right? Both the dragon and Beowulf die. The battle dodgers come back, right? The Hygelac. I just love that line, right? The battle dodgers who all come back. And they kind of, walk back up, probably with their heads hung low. And Wiglaf rebukes them, right? Wiglaf basically just gives them hell, yells at them. Anyone ready to admit the truth will surely realize that the Lord of Men, who showered you with gifts and gave you armor you are standing in, when he would distribute helmets and mail shirts to men on the mead benches, a prince treating his thane and hall to the best he could find far or near, was throwing weapons uselessly away, right? He gave you all of these weapons, all this armor, and you didn't use any of it. It would be a sad waste when the war broke out. Beowulf had little cause to brag about his armed guard. Pretty brutal. He goes on, right, just berating these people. Explains what happens. Says Beowulf is dead. And then he says this. So it is goodbye now to all you know and love. On your home ground, the open-handedness, the giving of war swords, every one of you with freeholds of land, our whole nation will be dispossessed. Once princes from beyond get tiding of how you turned and fled and disgraced yourself, a warrior will sooner die than live a life of shame. So this is pretty foreboding, right? Wiglaf basically says that when people find out that Beowulf's dead, we're all gonna die. We're gonna be invaded. Because now everyone knows that Beowulf, the only one who was keeping this kingdom safe for 50 years, is dead. And all of his men, they wouldn't even stand up to fight alongside Beowulf. We're doomed. And this goes on. He tells a messenger to go tell the other Geats what had happened. And this messenger has this very, very long speech, unnamed messenger, who goes on, right? He explains this whole battle. But this messenger also notes, now war is looming over our nation. Soon it will be known to Franks and Frisians far and wide that the king is gone. Remember the Frisian day raven that Beowulf killed? Well, that feud's still ongoing. What's going to happen with that? Right? When Hygelac sailed forth and began this feud with Friesland, with the Frisians, and Beowulf went and killed Dayraven to continue the blood feud and avenge Hygelac. Well, are the Frisians now going to come to Geatland and take back Geatland? Nor do I expect peace or pact keeping or any sort from the Swedes. Remember this whole feud with the Swedes, with the Shieldfings. Now they're going to come too. Right, the bloody swath that Swedes and Geats cut through each other was everywhere. No one could miss their murderous feuding. Basically, there are enemies everywhere that we have. And now they all know that Beowulf is dead. And, I mean, I think as we can get into this now, when you think about modern Scandinavia now, well, Denmark still exists. Sweden still exists. Frisia isn't in Scandinavia, to be fair, but it kind of still exists, right? Kind of in the Netherlands and Belgium and stuff. It doesn't exist? Geatland. And we actually know that the Geats all die out by, I think, about the late 7th century, maybe early 8th century. Their tribe is no more. They all die out. So they are conquered. Very, very sad. We get all this backstory again about this feud. I'm just going to kind of skip over all of this because we talked about a little bit of this, and a lot of it is just a lot of these details about these feuds. Right? They talk about building this funeral pyre. and that no one is going to be wearing these treasures, right? Treasure no follower will wear in his memory, nor lovely woman link and attach as a torque around her neck, but often repeatedly, in the path of exile, they shall walk bereft, bowed under woe, now that their leader's laugh is silenced, high spirits quenched. No one is getting these treasures, because there's no king to give it out. And there's no loyal thanes to give it to, right? All the thanes were pretty bad. So it's all going to be buried. And all of these men are now going to walk the paths of exiles. They see the dragon. They push it off the cliff. Right? They look upon Beowulf. And then Wiglaf speaks once more. Often when one man follows his own will, many are hurt. This happened to us. Nothing we advised could ever convince the prince we loved, our land's guardian, not to vex the custodian of the gold. Let him lie where he was long accustomed, lurk there under earth until the end of the world. He held to his high destiny. Again, I think I read this as a critique of Beowulf, that all of these men are hurt because of one man, Anas, right? When one man follows his own will, Anas Wilan. Right? All of these men have to pay for this because Beowulf, whatever you think of him, was a heroic man. Was he a good king? Did he have loyal supporters? Right? A good king is only as good as his supporters. Did he have an heir to the throne? He had neither of these. All of this is going to go away now that Beowulf is dead. And Wiglaf basically wants nothing to do with this and explains, like, we tried to talk him out of it. We couldn't get to him, and now he's dead, and now we're all gonna die. So they build this big funeral barrow, right? They're gonna burn the body. Flame shall consume our leader in battle. The blaze darken round him, who stood his ground to the steel hail, when the arrow storm shot from bowstrings pelted the shield wall. Right, all this great imagery. They build this barrow and put it on Hron's Ness, right, on Whale's Ness, right, on Whale's Inlet. We get the funeral. All these people are really sad. We even get this reference that I always find really interesting, that there's one Geat woman. A Geat woman too sang out in grief. With her hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears, a wild litany of nightmare and lament. Her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery, and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. Heaven reche swelg. She knows what's coming. And I just love the line, heaven swallowed the smoke. Again, we get this uncertainty. Does Beowulf go to heaven? Does he go to hell? It seems like the poet, again, is grappling with this. What happens to this heroic man? That, again, the poet clearly admires, but at the same time is still unsure of how to handle him. And we get the last page, right? A long description of the barrow. Beautiful. And then we get the last 3 lines of the poem, which are insanely famous and might change the way you read the poem. They said that of all kings upon the earth, he was most gracious and fair-minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame. So we get 4 attributes to Beowulf. He was most gracious and fair-minded and kindest to his people. Was he those things? I guess maybe. I think you could probably make, he's probably kind to his people. I mean, he didn't really help them in like any, he was probably kind to them. He didn't really help them though, right? Because now they're all going to die. He was gracious, kind of. I mean, he was kind of a braggart. Fair-minded, I guess. But this last bit, keenest to win fame.
und lof-geornost, right? Which literally means lof, fame or praise or something like that. A lot of people translate it as praise. Yearn, to yearn, to strive for. Ost is just like the superlative, right? Like est. So the most, right? The keenest. Is this a good thing? That's something we kind of have to ask ourselves. Is this a critique of Beowulf? Is this why he died? Because he was keenest to win fame? Or is this a good thing? I mean, the poets are right. I mean, and he won fame, of course. I mean, it's 2021, and we just read a poem about him, so clearly he's pretty damn famous. But this idea, a lot of scholars, this last word of the poem has probably caused the most scholarly inquiry and scholars arguing, because is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, it's up to you. And I think depending where you come down on this, is that a positive attribute or a negative attribute, then it has to change the way you read the entire poem. I think it's supposed to be pretty ambiguous. I like when authors are ambiguous. I like when authors give multiple readings. And I tend to read, as you can probably tell throughout this whole series, I tend to read Beowulf as pretty negative in a lot of ways, in that I think that he is a hero, but he's kind of a monster. And there is this blending of monstrosity and heroism. And this poet seems very concerned with this, and he doesn't really know how to deal with these heroes of the past, these Germanic heroes that are so important to their culture and their ethnicity and their language, right? All of these things are so important to this poet, but at the same time, this worldview in this poem, these ideas of heroic men and feuding and wealth and power, this is all antithetical to the Christian worldview that the poet is living in. And I read a lot of this poem as this poet trying to reconcile these two worldviews in whichever way that they can. And the poet having a lot of difficulty doing it, which I think is quite beautiful. I think that's quite nice, because I think this is how we should view history. We shouldn't just accept it and move on, and we shouldn't just throw it away and move on. We need to grapple with it, like Beowulf does with Grendel, right? We need to get it in our hand grip and grapple with it. And I think this is what this poem really does so well, is explore and probe at and think about in so many different ways how we use the past in the present and think about it. But anyways, I'm going on now. That's Beowulf. We skipped over a lot of good stuff, as you always have to whenever you're talking about a book. So I highly recommend, if you haven't read it, if you just listen to me, go and read it with some of this stuff in mind if you want. It really is just a wonderful poem. Just read it out loud to yourself. I always strongly encourage people, read this poem out loud. It is so beautiful and so good, and there's so much there, and you can read it for a lifetime. It's one of those kind of poems. But anyways, let me know what you think about Beowulf. Let me know what you think about this series, and thanks a lot for watching.